I'll tell you more about that in just a moment. It is good to be back with you again this evening. Ken, if you can turn me down just a little bit. Thank you, sir. We are going to do a continuation of some things we talked about this morning, and so we're just going to get right into it. Let's start off with a question for us. This is something we talked about several weeks ago when we did an evangelism series, and we talked about this morning. What are those 4 basic people principles that we've been discussing? All right, being available, sensitive, helpful, and creative, okay? And we're talking about these 4 things as far as our relationships, that we need to be people that are available, that we are sensitive to whatever context or background is going on there. Definitely want to be helpful. That's the whole thing about evangelism. But not just helpful as far as sharing God's word, but also finding other ways to be helpful too, that may give us inroads to be able to share God's word. And then being creative with each and every individual person, right? And this morning we talked about 2 different individuals, and who were they? Woman at the well and Nicodemus. Good. Okay. Those of you that paid attention, excellent, okay? Brent will give you your paycheck later, okay? So just go ask him. No, I'm just kidding. I thought he's coming in right there. Man, okay. All right, we talked about Nicodemus and the woman at the well. What did we learn, or what did you take home? It doesn't have to be something that I brought up, but what did you take home from any of that? Yes, Charlie. Okay. Both of the lessons that Jesus taught them were distinguished based off the lifestyle of the people that Jesus was talking to, right? Based off, and we could, if we're going to sermonize that, we can do 2 different L's, based off their location and their lifestyle, right? One being located there, obviously, in Jerusalem, another one being located in Samaria. Their lifestyle, one being a Pharisee, a part of the Sanhedrin, and the other one being the Samaritan woman and some of the issues that she had going on. Anything else that you gleaned from that? Yes, Miss Precious. They both needed Jesus, right? And that is definitely one of the points that we definitely need to learn from all of that, is not only did they need Jesus, but we all needed Jesus. We categorize these 2 people either as insiders or outsiders. And we saw that there was different ways of packaging the gospel versus the different people that you come in contact with. And as Precious just mentioned also, they all needed the same thing. They all needed the same Jesus. They needed the same gospel. Okay. Any other questions or comments about this morning before we move on to something different? Yes, ma'am.
Nicodemus specifically asked what needed to be done.
Definitely so.
And with the woman at the well, she didn't know what she needed.
And so what was said there is Nicodemus asked what needed to be done, and the woman at the well didn't even know what she needed as far as that. And I would dare say that there's people in our circles, in the relationships that we have, that are like that, right? Some people that may be seekers, and some people that don't know that they are seekers yet, that we can be able to help out as far as the gospel is concerned. Yes, Miss Ethel. If what? If we are to reach people, we have to be available. There's just no other way around that. And we can definitely be available in many different ways, whether it be physically available or available with a phone call, a text message, whatever the case may be. Strive to be available as one of those basic people principles. Anything else? These are all great. All right, let's think about some new material. We're going to contrast this evening 2 different audiences, okay? So this morning we looked at the Gospel of John and we looked at 2 different individuals. This evening we're going to look at 2 different audiences, different groups of people collectively, okay? And we're going to try to understand some keys for communicating the gospel. We'll talk about 3 things in just a minute that I want you to take home. I want you to be able to apply as far as communicating the gospel is concerned. So hopefully you're already at the book of Acts. The first place I want you to turn is to Acts chapter 2. Acts chapter 2. Somebody just help me. What is our overall context here? Acts 2. The day of Pentecost, okay? And why is the day of Pentecost an important day, especially when we think about Acts 2? All right, this is the beginning of the church. This is the beginning of the kingdom outposts of the church. This is the first time the gospel is being preached in its completion. What I mean by that the gospel, the good news was shared before, but before we never had the resurrection. Now we have the resurrection, and we can talk about that as being the true good news that Jesus not only died, but he overcame the grave too. Anything else that we want to bring up about the context in general there? Who's preaching? All right, Peter and the apostles, right? Peter seems to be the spokesperson here, but the apostles are included also. So let's think about Acts chapter 2, and who is the Acts chapter 2 audience? What are some things that you can tell me about them that may help shape or tailor the message that is going to be preached to them? Say again? Okay, they're people from all over the world. Charlie? They're all devout Jews from all over the world. In fact, look there in chapter 2 and in verse 5. And there were dwelling in Jerusalem devout men from every nation under heaven. All right? So these are devout men, and obviously they are talking about Jewish men. What else can we... Yes, Josh. Okay, some of them perhaps were part of the crucifixion scene. We don't know that for a fact, but we can definitely assume that some of the same people that perhaps were shouting, crucify him, are now some of the same people that are saying, men and brethren, what shall we do? Okay, so they have a very close relation to the actual death and crucifixion of Jesus. Something else about this audience that might shape our message. Okay, there's all kinds of different languages that are being spoken, but there's a caveat there. How do the apostles speak? In every language that they could, okay? So while they speak many different languages, at least for this scenario, they're all speaking one language. At least they're all understanding the language as if it was in their own tongue, okay? Or it's not as if. The apostles were able to speak in multiple different languages, so everybody heard the apostles speak in their own tongue. Okay, so yes, many languages, but at the same time, not many languages. Anything else? All right, it's still the same message being the gospel of Jesus Christ. And starting in verse 22, that Jesus lived, that he died, that he was buried, and that he rose again, and he is sitting on his throne. And let the whole house of Israel know, surely the same Jesus whom he crucified, God has made both Lord and Christ. And that's the overall message. Jesus is Lord. All right, we've mentioned these, but I almost want to bring them out a little bit more. Oh, yes, Precious.
I was just going to say, because they were there for the day of Pentecost, they were attentive. So they were there to hear, listen. So there were lots of leaders where they were asking what people needed to do.
Definitely so. So we would say that they were religious. They were devout, right? And that's what you talked about earlier, that these people went out of their way to travel to Jerusalem for the day of Pentecost. They could have, like some Jews, and not traveled to Jerusalem, but these men at least were Jews that wanted to continue to be devout and travel to Jerusalem for the day of Pentecost. First thing I want you to notice that separates these two groups out that we're going to look at, first of all, is that they were brethren, okay? What I mean by that is that they all were coming from the same playing field, if you will, that they were brothers in Israel, brothers in Judaism. Noah says in verse 22, okay, men of Israel, hear these words, okay? Men of Israel, he's referring to the Israelites, referring to Jewish people. Jump down to verse 29, men and brethren. So Peter is not saying that they are brethren as far as members of the church brethren, but they are brethren as far as they are all Jewish, okay? Who else is Jewish in this scenario? All right, Ananias later on is going to be Jewish, but the speaker who is speaking here, is he Jewish or Gentile? Peter is Jewish also, okay? So we see that we are all kind of the same, all right? They also are people who knew the Old Testament. Okay? Notice that Peter, several different times, but at least the ones I have mentioned there, in verse 16, he says, "But this is what was spoken by the prophet Joel." Now, when Peter says that, none of them go, "Who's Joel?" Nobody goes, "Well, what are you talking about?" These being devout men, they knew who the prophet Joel was, and many of them probably knew this verse. In verse 25, again, Peter speaking here says, "For David says concerning him." Again, they're not going to wonder, well, who is David? And why do I care what he says? They know who David is. They know what these prophecies are. They know these psalms. So they knew the Old Testament, and they had a certain amount of respect for the Old Testament. And because of that, when Peter is delivering this message, what can he use as his text? The Old Testament. Okay? They are going from the same source material. And so it's something that they can talk about there. Not only were they brethren, and that they knew the Old Testament, but also we could say that these people were all insiders. Okay? They already worshiped the same what? The same God. And that was part of the process that Peter and then later on other writers and speakers are trying to do to get the Jews to realize that the same God that you worship is Jesus in the flesh. That's who Jesus is. Jesus is Lord. I know that you have been worshiping Lord in the Old Testament. Well, let me explain to you that the Lord is actually Jesus. And so therefore you should follow after him. All right, any other questions or comments about Acts 2? I know it's quick, but we got to be quick. All right, turn to Acts 17. Acts 17. And we're going to ask the same questions here, okay? What about the Acts 17 audience? And we're not going to have time to read the entire thing, but I'm going to start, let's see, look starting in verse 18, Acts 17, 18. Then certain Epicurean and Stoic philosophers encountered him being Paul, and said, "What does this babbler want to say?" Others says, "He seems to be a proclaimer of foreign gods, because he preached to them Jesus and the resurrection." And they took him and brought him to the Areopagus, saying, "May we know what this new doctrine is of which you speak? For you are bringing some strange things to our ears. Therefore we want to know what these things mean." For all the Athenians and the foreigners who were there spent their time in nothing else, but either to tell or to hear some new thing. Then Paul stood up in the midst of the Areopagus and said, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in all things you are very religious. For I was passing through, and I considered the objects of your worship, and I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To the unknown God.'" Okay, we'll stop there for a second. Audience. All right, these are Gentiles. These are pagan Gentiles. And what we mean by that is they are not a worshiper of who? The Lord. They are not a worshiper of the Lord. They are a worshiper of many foreign gods. In fact, they think that Paul is bringing up a different foreign god. That he's going to just add that to the list of foreign gods that they already worship. Okay? Turn the page. Well, turn my page. Okay? Look in verse 24. God who made the world and everything in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands, nor is he worshipped with men's hands as though he needed anything, since he gives to all life, breath, and all things. And he has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on the face of the earth, and has determined their pre-appointed times and the boundaries of their dwellings, so that they should seek the Lord, in hope that they might grope for him and find him, though he is not far from each of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, as also some of your own poets have said, for we are also his offspring. Therefore, since we are the offspring of God, ought we not to think that the divine nature is like gold or silver or stone or something shaped by by art or by man's devising. All right. So they were pagans and Gentiles. What else can we say about them? They like learning. Okay, they like to discuss things, and it almost seems comical, at least in Acts 17, that all they enjoy doing is just talking about whatever is new or hearing about whatever is new. Think about the Acts 2 audience. What did we say in bullet point number 2? That they what? They knew the Old Testament. What about these people? They got no idea about the New Testament. They do not know anything about the Old Testament as far as we are concerned. And so when Paul, when he's trying to preach to them, does he go to the Old Testament to make his points? No. Why doesn't he go to the Old Testament? What good would that do? It would, so you're going to quote from David? I don't know who David is, and I don't care what he says. Oh, you're going to quote from Joel? I don't know who Joel is, and I don't care what he says. What about Isaiah? What about Moses? Any of these things is not going to make a hill of beans difference to those hearers. So what he does instead is he quotes their texts, okay? There is twice, there in verse 23 and also in verse 28, where Paul quotes not from Scripture, but from the Greeks, okay? I have, it's maybe a little small, but you can see it up there. One of the places that he quotes from is Epimenides. He was a 6th century BC poet, okay? And notice what he wrote. They fashioned a tomb for thee, O holy and high one. The Cretans, always liars, evil beasts, and idle bellies. By the way, Paul quotes that later on in Titus also. But thou art not dead. Thou livest and abidest forever. For in thee we live and move and have our being. Did you see that where Paul referenced that in the text? What's interesting about the source material here is this is him talking about Zeus. And there was the Cretans who were foolish because they had fashioned a tomb for Zeus. And the poet here is saying, you can't fashion a tomb for Zeus because Zeus is not dead. In fact, he's so not dead that it is in him that we live and move and have our being. And so what Paul is saying, hey, you know those things that poet said about Zeus? It's actually talking about the Lord. The Lord is not dead. In fact, in him we have our life and being. So much so that part of Paul's sermon is that Jesus has been resurrected. He's not dead. You can make a tomb for him, but he's not going to stay in the tomb. He's going to be resurrected. Yes, Chase?
Yeah, I found it helpful defense in people who like to correlate Jesus with Zeus, because you hear that often, like these similarities.
Right.
Is the fact that these philosophers that were in Greece, they basically said, what is this unknown doctrine? And if Jesus was something that related to Zeus in any way, then they would have already had some type of insight, which was just a point for some people who might encounter somebody.
Yeah, definitely. What Paul is trying to say here is that Jesus and Zeus are not the same individual or whatever. But what he is trying to say is that what you think about Zeus is actually what Jesus is. He is the God. Okay. Another person that he quotes is also Aratus. And you can see this quote also in Paul's. And he is a 3rd century BC poet. He says, "Let us begin with Zeus, whom we mortals never leave unnamed. For every street, every marketplace is full of Zeus. And even the sea and the harbor are full of his deity. Everywhere, everyone is indebted to Zeus, for we are indeed his offspring." So now Paul is using that text to try to point out, just as you think that you are descendants of Zeus, and if you as humans are descending something that is divine, why do you make those things which are divine silver and gold and stone? Are you silver, gold, and stone? Why do you worship these idols as if they are God, instead of realizing that the God that is everywhere, in fact, he is so close to you that he is wishing that you would just reach out, that you would grope for him so that you would find him. Okay? 2 different audiences, but he's delivering the same message. Okay? So pagan Gentiles, no Old Testament, but also these people were outsiders. When Paul talks about God, it conjures up in their head something extremely different than when he says God in the Acts chapter 2 audience. Okay? So I'm saying all of this to say we need to tailor or package our message to different people based off their different circumstances. We talked about in our Bible class this morning. If I'm going to try to talk to a Mormon elder about the church versus talking to a Catholic priest about the church, those conversations are going to start in two very different places. One, we at least have some semblance of continuity as far as the Catholicism in the Bible. Mormonism, they had a whole different book. That's going to be tough for me to jump in and just say, well, you need to turn in your Bible, and he's going to go, well, actually, we have a later revelation from the Lord Jesus Christ, and we prefer to follow that one instead of your precursor one that's out of date, right? And so that's going to change those things. Something else I want you to notice real quick is the different outcomes, okay? Acts chapter 2, what was the outcome of Peter's sermon? At least 3,000 souls were added into the church that day. Let's look at the outcome in Acts chapter 17. Read verse 32. And when they heard of the resurrection from the dead, some mocked, while others said, we will hear you again on this matter. So Paul departed from among them. However, some men joined him and believed, among them Dionysius the Areopagite, a woman named Damaris, and others with them. Acts 2, 3,000. What happens here in Acts 17? A handful. A handful, but also with the caveat that we may hear from you again. Okay? Two different outcomes. Same message, different groups of people, two different outcomes. Okay, here's the application part. Now, I'm going to go quick. I'm sorry, because we only got about 10 minutes left. But notice this. When we are dealing with different audiences, one thing as far as communication, keys to communicating, is we need to speak the same language. Okay, we need to speak the same language. Look over in Colossians and in chapter 4. Colossians chapter 4, verses 5 and 6. Here, Paul is giving some applicable things as he closes out his letter to the Colossians. He says, walk in wisdom towards those who are outside. Now, when he says outside, does he mean people that are outside, like enjoying nature? What does he mean? Outside of the body of believers. To the outsiders. Redeeming the time. Well, how are you going to redeem or take advantage of the time you have with them? Verse 6. Let your speech always be with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer each one. I think it's important to realize that it's each one, as in that maybe they may be different. But when you are speaking to the outsiders, be very careful about when you speak to the outsiders about the gospel that you don't use insider language. Okay? We have insider language as far as the church is concerned. Can you imagine in a non-church setting just going out and talking about propitiation? I mean, when's the last time in a non-church setting had you ever said propitiation? You don't. When you talk about, I had a whole list before, but there are various different things that sometimes that we may talk about insider language that the outsiders may not use. So we need to talk to people in their own language. Not only in their own language, thinking about whether they're a foreign language or not, but just be careful about what we say to them so that it can be understandable. We need to beware of the gobbledygook, okay? What I mean by the gobbledygook is you can, I'll just pick on Amber for a second. I hope that's okay. Anyway, we were at the signing for Cortland the other day, and there was another kid that was being signed also who played football, and he was going to play football as being a long snapper. And there was great confusion about why in the world would somebody recruit a long snapper, right? And obviously, if you perhaps are not in the football realm, there is all kinds of words that people who are playing football can say to each other that if somebody from the outside came in, that would have no idea what you're talking about, right? I saw one of my buddies I played football with in high school, and I could go up to him today and still say 328 waggle, B3. And he would know exactly what I meant by that. Everyone else would not. But that's because that's the language that we spoke as far as our naming system of our plays and stuff when we were in high school. We got to also be careful of our gobbledygook when it comes to evangelizing the people. I'll pick on Brent. I told him I was going to use him in this illustration. Brent, in his job, there is a certain set of words and words that they use all the time that I never use. And sometimes when he is talking to me about doing certain things and communicating to me, I have to slow myself down and really listen to what he's saying, because he is using terminology that he uses in his everyday work life that I never use in my everyday work life. When it comes to also our evangelism, we need to make sure that we are speaking the same language. Secondly, we need to make sure that we are going the same pace as somebody else. When we talk about evangelism, we do not want to push people, nor do we want to drag people. Walk at their pace. It's interesting there in Acts chapter 17 that people rejected Paul. Some of them did, but they also said, well, we want to hear you later on this. That's going at their pace, right? And I will go back and maybe we can talk some more and move along at these things, okay? Remember that when we are evangelizing, we are guiding people to their faith, not your faith, or not my faith. I do not want someone to be a David Pharr Christian. I want them to be a Christian, right? And so they have to accept these things on their own good time so it can be their faith. If we don't do that, then there might come a time where you convert somebody and then a job takes you somewhere else, or a job takes them somewhere else. Have they been dependent upon your faith to be faithful? Then how are they going to be faithful, right? It's got to be their faith. Here's something else that I thought about in discussing this, is Christianity is not a mid-level marketing organization, okay? A lot of times in the multi-level marketing organizations, there's the push to get somebody else on board, right? You got to use these tactics, and sometimes you are just forcing people, it seems, to get on board. That is not what we're trying to do with evangelism, okay? We never want to push somebody into the baptistry, if you will, because if we do, then all we're doing is getting them wet. We're not converting them to Christ, okay? So go at their own pace. And then finally, go to the same location, whether it be physically or spiritually, okay? And what I mean by this is that people are starting in different spots. Those in Acts chapter 2, they started at a spot that was nowhere close to Acts chapter 17. And Paul does not go to Acts chapter 17 and preach to them like Peter did in Acts chapter 2, because that's not their location. That is not their spiritual location. We need to go to where they are. Also with this, evangelism is not just for the pews. That does not need to be where evangelism happens first, nor should it be where evangelism happens most. Evangelism should take place in other places. Home, work, the bleacher, if you will, next to other parents on your kids' teams, through texts, etc. That's where evangelism should take place first and the most. Very rarely is someone saved because they just happened to accidentally walk inside a church building and heard a gospel sermon. It happens because people are in relationship and they are talking about the Lord. They are speaking their language, going at their pace, being at their location, okay? And those are the things that we want to think about. We got 2.5 minutes if there's any questions, comments, or other concerns. Sorry, I went a little fast towards the end. Yes, Tarsha, thank you.
As a runner like you, I definitely love the PC.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely so. So in running, and this is a great illustration, in running a lot of times you have a pacer. And that pacer's job is supposed to be to pace a certain time. But all of us have experienced what we refer to as poor pacers. There is sometimes a pacer that obviously is not thinking about the group that they are pacing, and they run at whatever pace that they want to run, and they leave you behind. And when that happens, now that whole group that was supposed to be following you is going to fail. There's other times that a pacer is not doing their job and that they can't keep up with the pace that's supposed to be. But the same way we think about in spirituality, walk at the same pace as somebody, right? Think about the other examples in the Bible, right? You think about the Ethiopian eunuch and Philip. How can I unless someone guide me? And Philip doesn't go in and say, well, why don't you understand all these things? And just moves on really quick. Philip starts where the eunuch is. He starts at that place and preaches unto him Jesus. He preaches at that pace with him. So also don't be discouraged, okay? Well, I mean, we all get discouraged in different ways. But maybe you have been working on someone and evangelizing to them and evangelizing to them. And maybe there's been no outcome yet. Maybe there's been no conversion yet. Don't get discouraged in that. I much rather it take a much longer period of time and it be their faith than for you to finally get to a gotcha moment and throw them into the baptistry. Okay, I was talking with someone, in fact, last week, and they were talking about how that they've been having a discussion with someone. This individual, actually this whole family has been converted now, but at one point in time, the lady that she was studying with said that she wanted to be baptized. And in actuality, the person that was studying with her slowed her down for a minute and said, I want you to realize this for yourself, not just because I have told you something. And so she did slow down and she went back and looked at things more, studied things more, and all those things. And now she has been converted, and it's not because of someone else's faith. It's because it is her own faith. Okay? Language, pace, and location. And I hear the natives outside. So let's go ahead and close things up with a word of prayer. Our gracious Father in heaven, we are so thankful for another day. We're thankful for all the many blessings that you give us. We thank you for loving us so very much. We're thankful that someone came along and spoke to us in a language that we could understand and went with us at a pace that we could follow and came to us where we were and taught us the gospel. Father, help us to do the exact same to those other people that we have in our fields, in our circles, in our relationships, that we can strive to be impactful for your kingdom. Thank you so much for your Son, Jesus Christ, the same individual that we all need, the same salvation that we all need, and help us to follow after him in all that we do. It's in your Son's name we pray.